The person who never loses their temper, always says yes, and constantly apologizes for existing, might be the most psychologically volatile individual in any room. While everyone fears the obviously aggressive personality, the truly dangerous person often hides behind perpetual politeness, excessive agreeability, and an almost pathological need to be liked by everyone. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, uncovered a disturbing psychological truth that most people refuse to acknowledge. The individuals who present themselves as endlessly nice, helpful, and accommodating often harbor the deepest wells of unconscious rage, resentment, and destructive potential. Their niceness isn't genuine kindness. It's a carefully constructed defense mechanism, protecting both themselves and others from what lies beneath. This revelation challenges everything society teaches about character assessment. The quiet, helpful colleague might be seething with suppressed fury. The perpetually agreeable friend could be unconsciously planning emotional revenge. The person who never says no might be accumulating psychological debt that will eventually demand catastrophic payment. What follows exposes the hidden psychology behind excessive niceness, revealing why the most agreeable people often become the most dangerous, and how to recognize when apparent kindness masks something far more sinister. The mask of niceness. Society rewards niceness with almost religious fervor. Children learn early that being good means suppressing difficult emotions, agreeing with authority, and prioritizing others' comfort over their own authentic responses. Schools praise the compliant student while labeling assertive children as problems. Workplaces promote the agreeable team player while viewing boundary setters as difficult. Jung recognized that this societal conditioning creates profound psychological distortion. When someone consistently presents themselves as unfailingly nice, they're performing emotional labor that comes at tremendous internal cost. Real human beings experience anger, frustration, disappointment, and irritation. When these natural responses get systematically suppressed, they don't disappear, they go underground. The overly nice person operates from what Jung called the persona, a mask worn to gain social acceptance. This mask becomes so elaborate, so convincing, that even they begin believing it represents their true nature. Meanwhile, their authentic self gets banished to the unconscious. This creates a dangerous psychological split. The conscious mind maintains the nice facade while the unconscious accumulates every suppressed frustration, every swallowed insult, every moment of unexpressed anger. Jung observed that the more perfect someone's conscious persona appears, the more likely their unconscious contains its complete opposite. Watch how someone responds to minor frustrations, canceled plans, slow service, unexpected changes. The genuinely balanced person shows proportionate irritation. The dangerous nice person maintains their smile while something inside them quietly takes notes. Jung's shadow theory. Jung's most unsettling discovery was the shadow, the repository of everything about ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. As he wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. For the compulsively nice person, this shadow becomes a psychological powder keg. The shadow contains all the traits, impulses, and emotions that contradict our idealized self-image. Jung explained in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. The nice person avoids this moral effort entirely, preferring to maintain their sanitized self-concept. What makes this particularly dangerous is shadow projection. Jung observed, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The person who cannot acknowledge their own capacity for cruelty, manipulation, or selfishness will unconsciously project these qualities onto others. Jung noted in Man and His Symbols, the shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. For someone whose entire identity revolves around being nice, aggressive impulses become the ultimate taboo. They literally cannot afford to recognize their anger because it would shatter their carefully constructed persona. Perhaps most chilling, Jung recognized that The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The nice person avoids this terror through constant external focus, helping others, pleasing everyone, staying busy with other people's needs. But the avoided self doesn't disappear, it grows stronger in darkness. Begin noticing when you feel irritated, but immediately suppress it with nice thoughts. That moment of suppression is where shadow material gets created. The psychology of repressed aggression. Aggression is a fundamental life force that establishes boundaries, protects resources, and asserts individual will. When this natural force gets systematically repressed, it transforms into something far more destructive than healthy, direct anger ever could be. Jung understood this dynamic deeply, writing in The Undiscovered Self. The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. But the compulsively nice person never allows conflicts to surface. Instead, they accumulate unresolved tension that manifests in sophisticated forms of indirect aggression. Passive aggression becomes their primary weapon. They agree to commitments, then subtly sabotage them. They offer help while unconsciously ensuring it creates more problems. They smile while delivering cutting observations disguised as innocent comments. The repressed aggression often emerges through emotional labor extraction. The nice person becomes expertly skilled at making others feel guilty for not reciprocating their endless giving. They create subtle debts that can never be fully repaid, fostering dependency while maintaining their helpful image. Physical symptoms frequently manifest before psychological ones: unexplained fatigue, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders. The body keeps score of suppressed aggression even when consciousness refuses to acknowledge it. Pay attention to people who seem to attract dramatic situations despite their peaceful intentions. Often their unconscious aggression is creating the very chaos they consciously deplore. When nice people explode. The explosion, when it comes, is rarely proportional to the triggering event. Jung warned in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. The unconscious compensates the conscious attitude, and when this attitude is excessive, produces a counterposition, which is equally excessive. The nice person's breakdown often appears without warning, because they've become expert at hiding stress signals from others and themselves. This emotional suppression creates what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to transform into their opposite when taken to extremes. When the facade finally cracks, the released aggression carries the concentrated force of years of suppression. Jung noted, "The shadow becomes hostile only when it is ignored or misunderstood." The nice person has done both systematically, creating an internal enemy that eventually demands recognition through dramatic action. These explosions often target innocent bystanders rather than the actual sources of accumulated frustration. The aftermath typically involves shame, confusion, and desperate attempts to rebuild the nice persona. Notice how someone responds when their helpfulness gets rejected. Genuine kindness accepts no gracefully. Manipulative niceness often reveals its true nature when rebuffed. What this means for you. Understanding dangerous niceness transforms how you navigate relationships. First, examine your own niceness patterns. Are you suppressing authentic responses to maintain approval? Jung warned, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." When dealing with compulsively nice people, maintain clear boundaries regardless of their protests. Their niceness often aims to dissolve your limits, making you feel guilty for protecting yourself. Trust your energy levels after interactions. Authentic kindness leaves you feeling energized or neutral. Manipulative niceness creates inexplicable fatigue because you've absorbed their unconscious aggression. Stop trying to fix the chronically nice person. Your efforts only feed their unconscious need to remain helpless while appearing grateful. The uncomfortable truth about kindness. Real kindness doesn't announce itself. It flows naturally from psychological wholeness, requiring no recognition, creating no debt, expecting nothing in return. Jung observed in The Development of Personality. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Genuine kindness can say no without guilt. express irritation without collapse, and prioritize their own needs without shame. The dangerous nice person has abandoned this psychological integration for social approval. Their excessive agreeability isn't kindness, it's cowardice. Their endless helping isn't generosity, it's manipulation. Their perpetual smile isn't joy, it's terror of rejection. The most chilling realization? They often don't know they're dangerous. Their shadow operates completely outside conscious awareness, wreaking havoc while their persona maintains perfect innocence. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse someone's excessive niceness. You might be the first person to hold up a mirror to their shadow. The most dangerous people in your life don't announce their intentions. They don't carry weapons or make obvious threats. Instead, they operate in the shadows of human psychology, slowly draining your energy, distorting your reality, and sabotaging your growth while maintaining a facade of normalcy or even helpfulness. Carl Jung, through decades of clinical observation, identified specific personality patterns that consistently destroy others' psychological well-being. These aren't random toxic behaviors. They're systematic psychological attacks that target the unconscious mind. Jung recognized that certain individuals seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to locate and exploit others' psychological vulnerabilities. What makes these people particularly dangerous is their invisibility. They often appear charming, successful, or even caring. By the time their victims realize what's happening, significant psychological damage has already occurred. Jung's warning wasn't just theoretical, it was practical. He observed that these three specific types of people could derail anyone's psychological development, destroy their sense of reality, and leave them questioning their own sanity. The energy vampire. Jung observed certain individuals who seemed to feed off others' psychological energy, leaving their targets feeling inexplicably drained, confused, and depleted. These aren't metaphorical vampires. They're people whose psychological structure requires constant external energy to maintain their sense of self. The energy vampire operates through what Jung called psychological participation mystique, a primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other become blurred. They unconsciously merge with others' energy fields, extracting vitality while contributing nothing in return. Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, the psychological relationship between doctor and patient is a mutual one. But the energy vampire perverts this natural exchange, creating a one-way flow that benefits only them. These individuals are masters of manufactured crisis. They create constant emergencies, dramas, and problems that demand others' immediate attention and emotional investment. Just when you think you've helped them resolve an issue, a new crisis emerges. They possess an uncanny ability to identify empathetic, giving people and quickly establish intense emotional connections. They share intimate details about their struggles, creating artificial intimacy that makes you feel special and needed. But Jung warned that this apparent vulnerability is actually a sophisticated hunting technique. The energy vampire's most insidious weapon is emotional projection. They unconsciously dump their anxiety, depression, anger, and confusion into your psychological space. After spending time with them, you find yourself feeling emotions that don't belong to you. Recognition comes through paying attention to your energy levels. If you consistently feel drained, confused, or emotionally hijacked after interacting with someone, you've encountered an energy vampire. The shadow projector. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging of Jung's three types is the shadow projector. Someone who cannot tolerate their own darkness and systematically projects it onto others. Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, "The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be." The shadow projector takes this avoidance to pathological extremes. These individuals possess an almost supernatural ability to locate and activate others' insecurities, wounds, and self-doubts. They become psychological archaeologists, excavating your buried shame and reflecting it back to you amplified. What's particularly insidious is that they often target your greatest strengths, reframing them as weaknesses. Jung observed that shadow projectors operate through what he called psychological infection. They transmit their own unconscious conflicts into others' minds through subtle suggestions, implications, and emotional manipulations. You begin seeing yourself through their distorted lens, doubting your perceptions and questioning your worth. The shadow projector's favorite weapon is gaslighting, systematically undermining your reality testing by contradicting your experiences, denying their behavior, and suggesting you're overly sensitive or mentally unstable. Jung warned that this technique specifically targets what he called the reality function, your ability to distinguish between inner and outer reality. These individuals are masters of psychological reversal. When confronted about their behavior, they immediately flip the script, positioning themselves as the victim and you as the aggressor. Jung noted that this reversal serves a dual purpose. It absolves them of responsibility while simultaneously implanting guilt and self-doubt in their target. Perhaps most destructively, shadow projectors actively work to isolate you from supportive relationships. They plant seeds of doubt about your friends, family, and colleagues, gradually convincing you that you can only trust their version of reality. Watch for people who consistently leave you questioning your own judgment, feeling guilty for setting boundaries, or doubting your memories of interactions. The growth saboteur. The third type Jung identified as the growth saboteur who systematically undermines others' attempts at psychological development and self-actualization. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. The growth saboteur represents the tribe's resistance to individual development. These individuals appear supportive of your goals while simultaneously creating obstacles to achieving them. They offer help that creates dependence, give advice that leads nowhere, and provide encouragement that actually discourages. Their sabotage is so subtle that you often blame yourself for lack of progress." Jung observed that growth saboteurs are unconsciously threatened by others' development because it highlights their own psychological stagnation. They cannot tolerate witnessing someone else's transformation because it activates their own unlived potential, a phenomenon Jung called the unlived life. The growth saboteur employs what Jung termed psychological leveling, bringing others down to their level of development rather than rising to meet them. They accomplish this through constant criticism disguised as concern, impossible standards disguised as high expectations, and discouragement disguised as realism. These individuals are masters of timing their interventions. Just when you're gaining momentum toward a goal, experiencing a breakthrough, or developing new confidence, they appear with perfectly timed doubt, criticism, or crisis that derails your progress. Perhaps most insidiously, they redefine growth itself, convincing you that real development means accepting limitations, lowering expectations, or focusing on others' needs instead of your own. They turn psychological development into psychological imprisonment. Why you attract them. Jung understood that these toxic encounters aren't random. They're magnetized by unconscious psychological patterns. His concept of psychological complexes explains why certain people repeatedly attract the same destructive relationships. You attract energy vampires when you have unhealed wounds around self-worth and boundaries. Your unconscious need to feel needed creates a beacon for those who need constant support. Shadow projectors target people with underdeveloped psychological defenses and strong empathetic abilities. Growth saboteurs are drawn to those with unrealized potential who lack confidence in their own development. Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." These toxic attractions feel like fate, but they're actually unconscious psychological patterns seeking resolution. Breaking these patterns requires what Jung called individuation, becoming conscious of your unconscious psychological material. This means examining why you feel responsible for others' emotions, why you doubt your own perceptions, and why you seek permission to grow. Your psychological defense. Jung's protection strategy centers on what he called conscious relationship to the unconscious. This means developing awareness of your psychological vulnerabilities before others can exploit them. First, strengthen your psychological boundaries. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But transformation should be mutual and beneficial, not parasitic." Practice what Jung called active imagination. consciously engaging with your own shadow material so others can't use it against you. When you accept your capacity for selfishness, anger, and limitation, shadow projectors lose their power to shame you with these qualities. Develop what Jung termed psychological objectivity, the ability to observe interactions without being consumed by them. This creates emotional distance that protects against energy vampires and manipulation. Most importantly, commit to your own individuation process. Jung observed that people who are actively developing psychologically become less attractive to toxic individuals because they're no longer easy targets. The ultimate protection is becoming whole enough within yourself that you don't need others to complete you, validate you, or give you permission. When you stop seeking external completion, you stop attracting those who profit from your incompleteness. These three types of people will always exist, but they only have power over those who remain unconscious of their own psychological patterns. Jung's warning comes with a promise. Know yourself, and no one can destroy what you've become. If you're experiencing thoughts of self-harm or suicide, please contact a mental health professional immediately or call a crisis helpline. What follows is educational content about psychological theory, not medical advice. What if the depression that's been crushing your spirit isn't actually an enemy to be defeated, but a messenger carrying crucial information about your life? What if the very thing you've been trying to eliminate is actually your psyche's desperate attempt to communicate something vital that your conscious mind refuses to hear? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist, held a revolutionary view that contradicted nearly everything the medical establishment believed about depression. While others saw it as pure pathology to be medicated away, Jung recognized depression as one of the most important communications the human psyche can send. He observed that depression often emerges precisely when someone's life has become fundamentally misaligned with their authentic nature. Jung didn't romanticize depression or suggest people should suffer needlessly. Instead, he recognized that beneath the crushing weight of depressive episodes often lay profound wisdom about necessary life changes, unlived potential, and suppressed aspects of personality demanding recognition. Depression as messenger. Jung observed that depression rarely arrives without reason, though its logic operates beneath conscious awareness. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." Depression often emerges when this privilege has been systematically denied or abandoned. The depressive episode functions like a psychological fever, an uncomfortable but necessary process that signals something fundamental needs attention. Just as physical pain alerts us to bodily damage, depression alerts us to psychological damage. The mistake most people make is treating the messenger instead of listening to the message. Jung noticed that depression frequently coincided with major life transitions, career dissatisfaction, relationship breakdowns, or periods when people felt trapped in inauthentic roles. Rather than seeing these as coincidences, he recognized them as the psyche's response to living in ways that violated core psychological needs. The unconscious mind, Jung theorized, maintains a complete picture of who someone truly is, including unlived potentials, suppressed desires, and authentic values. When conscious life diverges too far from this inner blueprint, the unconscious sends increasingly urgent signals. Consider how many people report that their depression lifted only after making major life changes, leaving unfulfilling careers, ending toxic relationships, or pursuing previously ignored creative interests. Jung would argue that depression was the messenger pushing toward these necessary transformations. Pay attention to what thoughts, memories, or desires emerge during depressive episodes. Often, these contain clues about the life changes your psyche is demanding. The compensation theory. Jung's theory of compensation suggests that the psyche constantly seeks balance. When conscious attitudes become too one-sided, the unconscious produces compensatory content to restore equilibrium. Depression often represents this compensatory mechanism taken to extremes. Jung explained in Psychological Types, the unconscious compensates the conscious attitude, and when this attitude is excessive, produces a counterposition which is equally excessive. Someone who lives in a hyperactive, achievement-oriented manner might experience depression as the psyche's attempt to force rest and reflection. Modern culture particularly creates conditions ripe for compensatory depression. Society rewards certain traits, productivity, optimism, social conformity, while pathologizing their opposites. People learn to suppress aspects of themselves that don't fit cultural ideals, creating psychological imbalances that eventually demand correction. The compensation theory explains why some depressions resist traditional treatment. Antidepressants might temporarily suppress symptoms, but if the underlying psychological imbalance remains unaddressed, the depression often returns. Jung argued that lasting healing requires recognizing and integrating whatever aspects of personality have been suppressed. Notice what depression makes impossible in your life. These might be the very activities your psyche needs you to abandon. Notice what becomes more appealing during depressive episodes. These might point toward neglected aspects of your authentic nature. When your soul rebels. Jung made a crucial distinction between personal and impersonal depression. Personal depression relates to specific circumstances. Impersonal depression connects to what Jung termed the soul, the deeper aspects of human nature that transcend individual psychology. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Soul-level depression emerges when someone's entire life structure violates their deepest nature. Soul rebellion often manifests as a pervasive sense of meaninglessness that no external achievement can touch. Someone might have success, relationships, and security, yet feel completely empty inside. Traditional approaches often fail here because they address symptoms rather than the soul's revolt against an inauthentic existence. The soul rebels against lives built on external expectations rather than inner truth. It refuses to participate in performances that betray core values. It withdraws energy from activities that feel meaningless regardless of how successful they appear to others. This type of depression can't be cured through lifestyle changes because it's responding to internal betrayal, the betrayal of one's authentic nature in service of social acceptability. Listen to what feels meaningless in your life, even if it appears successful from the outside. Your soul might be withdrawing energy from activities that no longer serve your authentic development. The creative illness. Jung introduced the concept of creative illness, a specific type of psychological crisis that precedes major creative or spiritual breakthroughs. Unlike pathological depression, creative illness serves a transformative function, breaking down outdated psychological structures to make room for new development. Jung experienced his own creative illness between 1913 and 1917, a period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. During this time, he experienced severe depression-like symptoms. Yet this period proved to be the most creatively fertile of his life. Creative illness often affects individuals who have outgrown their current psychological framework, but haven't yet developed a new one. The old personality structure can no longer contain their expanding consciousness, creating temporary but intense psychological chaos. This type of depression often feels different from ordinary sadness. People report feeling like they're dissolving or losing their sense of identity. While frightening, these symptoms often indicate that rigid psychological boundaries are softening to allow for transformation. Recognize creative illness by its timing. It often follows periods of intense growth and typically carries undertones of excitement despite the suffering. Decoding your depression. Jung believed that depression speaks in symbolic language that requires interpretation rather than elimination. Learning to decode depression's messages transforms it from meaningless suffering into meaningful communication. Start by examining what depression makes impossible. If it prevents social interaction, consider whether you've been over-functioning socially. If it blocks productivity, examine whether you've been using busyness to avoid inner reflection. Next, notice what emerges during depressive episodes. Do certain memories surface repeatedly? Do specific desires feel more appealing? Jung viewed these emergent contents as messages from the unconscious about needed psychological adjustments. Pay attention to the quality of your depression. Does it feel heavy and stuck, suggesting resistance to necessary change? Does it feel empty and hollow, suggesting disconnection from authentic meaning? Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." Depression often forces this inward looking by making external distractions unbearable. Consider what your depression might be protecting you from. Sometimes depression serves as a psychological cocoon, creating necessary isolation during vulnerable transformation periods. Most importantly, approach your depression with curiosity rather than judgment. Jung observed that symptoms often contain the seeds of their own healing when properly understood. Depression isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the most honest friend you have, forcing you to confront what your conscious mind refuses to see. Your depression might be the most important message you'll ever receive. The question isn't how to silence it, but whether you're ready to listen. The inability to move on from someone isn't about love. It's about psychological confusion. The person you can't forget isn't holding power because of who they are, but because of what parts of yourself you've unconsciously projected onto them. Carl Jung discovered that our most intense attachments often have nothing to do with the actual person and everything to do with psychological projections, unconscious parts of ourselves that we've placed onto them. When someone becomes impossible to forget, you haven't actually lost them. You've lost touch with essential parts of yourself that you never realized you'd given away. This isn't about dismissing genuine love or grief. Jung understood that profound connections create real psychological bonds. But pathological attachment, the kind that destroys your peace and keeps you emotionally imprisoned, represents a fundamental confusion about where you end and others begin. The secret to moving on isn't about forgetting someone. It's about reclaiming the psychological energy you've invested in them and discovering that what you thought you lost was never theirs to begin with. The projection problem. Jung observed that humans unconsciously project their own psychological material onto others, especially during intense relationships. In The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, he wrote, "Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face." When you can't move on from someone, you're often unable to move on from projected aspects of yourself. Every quality you admire, fear, or desperately miss in another person represents something within your own psychological makeup that you've either disowned or never developed. The charismatic partner who made you feel alive carried your own unlived vitality. The confident friend who seemed to have life figured out reflected your own undeveloped self-assurance. Projection happens unconsciously and automatically. Jung noted that we project most powerfully onto people who can carry the projection convincingly, someone whose personality resonates with the disowned aspect of ourselves. This creates what feels like a perfect match, but it's actually a psychological mirage. The devastating pain of losing someone often comes not from losing their actual presence, but from losing access to these projected parts of yourself. When they leave, you feel incomplete because you genuinely are incomplete. Not because they took something from you, but because you never realized these qualities belong to you. The first step in reclaiming your projections is honest self-examination. What specific qualities made this person irreplaceable? What did they seem to possess that you felt you lacked? These answers point directly to the parts of yourself that need to be reclaimed. Participation mystique. Jung borrowed the term participation mystique to describe a psychological state where boundaries between self and other become dangerously blurred. In intense relationships, people unconsciously merge their psychological identities, creating what Jung called unconscious identity. When participation mystique develops, you lose the ability to distinguish between your emotions and theirs, your thoughts and theirs, your identity and theirs. Jung wrote in Psychological Types, "The subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it in a relationship of almost mystical character." This explains why ending certain relationships feels like psychological death. You begin defining yourself through their responses, measuring your worth through their approval, and organizing your emotional reality around their presence. Your sense of self becomes so intertwined with them that their departure threatens your entire identity structure. Jung observed that participation mystique is particularly common in relationships where one or both people have weak individual identity development. Instead of two complete people choosing to connect, you have two incomplete people trying to create wholeness through merger. Breaking participation mystique requires what Jung called differentiation, the conscious process of separating your psychological material from theirs. This means identifying which emotions belong to you, which thoughts originate from your own mind, and which parts of your identity exist independently of their validation. Start by spending time alone without any contact or reminders of this person. Notice what remains of your personality, interests, and emotional life when their influence is completely removed. The anima-animus trap. Jung's concepts of anima, the unconscious feminine aspect in men, and animus, the unconscious masculine aspect in women, explain some of the most intense and difficult to release attachments. When someone embodies your contrasexual archetype, the connection feels faded, mystical, and impossible to replicate. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, the anima is the archetype of life itself. When a man projects his anima onto a woman, she seems to embody everything vital and life-giving that he feels he lacks. When a woman projects her animus onto a man, he appears to possess all the strength and authority she feels she needs. These projections create relationships that feel larger than life because they're connecting you to archetypal energies rather than just personal qualities. The person becomes a gateway to parts of the psyche that feel essential for psychological completion. Anima-animus projections often manifest as instant recognition, feeling like you've known this person forever, or experiencing them as the missing piece of yourself. The relationship feels destined, meaningful beyond normal human connection. But Jung warned that no real person can carry the weight of an entire archetype. When they inevitably reveal their human limitations, the projection collapses, often creating devastating disillusionment. Moving on from anima-animus projections requires developing these qualities within yourself. Men must cultivate their own emotional depth and intuition. Women must develop their own authority and decisiveness, withdrawing your projections. Jung's method for breaking pathological attachments centers on systematically withdrawing your psychological projections. Start by creating what Jung called psychological distance. This means eliminating contact temporarily, not as punishment, but as a laboratory for examining your own psychological reactions without external interference. Next, practice what Jung termed active imagination. Visualize conversations with this person, but instead of focusing on what they might say, pay attention to what parts of yourself emerge in imagined dialogue. Often you'll discover that the voice you attribute to them actually represents disowned aspects of your own inner wisdom. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." Projection prevents this privilege by keeping essential parts of yourself externalized. Withdrawing projections means reclaiming these disowned qualities and developing them within your own personality. Create a detailed list of everything you miss about this person: their confidence, creativity, humor, intelligence. Then honestly examine how much of each quality exists undeveloped within yourself. This exercise reveals the roadmap for your own psychological development. Begin cultivating these qualities independently. If you projected creativity onto them, start creating. If you projected confidence, begin taking risks. Jung observed that successfully withdrawn projections don't diminish appreciation for others. They enhance it. The path to psychological freedom. Jung's ultimate solution to attachment problems was individuation, the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole and self-contained. He wrote in The Development of Personality, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." Individuation doesn't mean isolation or emotional numbness. It means developing such psychological completeness that relationships become choices rather than compulsions. You connect with others from abundance rather than need, appreciation rather than dependency. The path begins with what Jung called shadow work, acknowledging and integrating the disowned parts of yourself that you've been projecting onto others. This includes not just positive qualities, but negative ones too. True psychological freedom emerges when you can appreciate someone fully without needing to possess them, love someone deeply without losing yourself, and release someone completely without feeling diminished. Jung recognized that the most profound relationships occur between two individuated people who choose each other from wholeness rather than neediness. But this requires that each person first develop the capacity to be complete alone. The person you can't move on from has given you the greatest gift possible. They've shown you exactly what parts of yourself need to be reclaimed and developed. Your task isn't to forget them, but to become so complete within yourself that you no longer need anyone else to feel whole. Moving on isn't about finding someone better, it's about becoming someone complete. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please seek professional help immediately. Contact a healthcare provider, addiction specialist, or call a substance abuse helpline. What follows is educational content about psychological theory, not medical advice or treatment. Society tells you that addiction is a disease, a moral failing, or a lack of willpower. Rehab centers focus on breaking habits, managing cravings, and staying clean through sheer determination. Yet relapse rates remain devastatingly high, and millions continue to struggle despite repeated attempts at sobriety. What if the entire approach is fundamentally wrong? Carl Jung discovered something that revolutionized his understanding of addiction. And it had nothing to do with substances, willpower, or brain chemistry. Through his work with alcoholics and his correspondence with Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung uncovered a disturbing truth. Addiction isn't really about the substance. It's about spiritual starvation. Jung observed that addiction represents the soul's desperate attempt to find transcendence, meaning, and connection through artificial means. The alcoholic isn't just seeking chemical relief, they're seeking religious experience. Every addiction, Jung realized, masks a spiritual crisis that conventional treatment completely ignores. Addiction as spiritual crisis. Jung's most famous insight about addiction came from his work with Roland Hazard, an alcoholic businessman who couldn't stay sober despite multiple attempts at treatment. Jung told Hazard something that would reshape addiction recovery forever. His craving for alcohol was actually the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. In Jung's view, the Latin phrase spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit, captured the essence of addiction recovery. Only genuine spiritual experience could counter the artificial spirituality that addiction provides. Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, "You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as for the most depraving poison." Jung observed that addicts often described their substance use in quasi-religious terms, seeking transcendence, escaping ordinary consciousness, experiencing unity and bliss. The problem wasn't that these desires were wrong, but that they were being pursued through destructive means. Jung recognized that modern secular culture had largely abandoned legitimate spiritual practices, leaving people spiritually malnourished. Addiction filled this void with counterfeit transcendence, temporary experiences of expansion, relief from existential anxiety, and artificial connection to something greater than oneself. The addictive substance becomes what Jung called a God substitute, providing experiences that healthy spiritual practice should supply: peace, meaning, community, and temporary escape from ego consciousness. But because these experiences are chemically induced rather than spiritually earned, they create dependency rather than growth. Jung noted that addiction often intensifies during periods of spiritual crisis. Midlife transitions, existential questioning, loss of meaning, or disconnection from purpose. The substance provides temporary relief from what he called spiritual emergency, but ultimately deepens the crisis by preventing authentic spiritual development. Recognize that craving often masks deeper longing for meaning, connection, or transcendence. The intensity of addictive desire often reflects the intensity of unmet spiritual needs. The compensation theory. Jung's theory of psychological compensation revealed another crucial aspect of addiction. When conscious life becomes too one-sided, rigid, or disconnected from authentic nature, the unconscious produces compensatory behaviors to restore balance. Addiction often represents this compensatory mechanism taken to destructive extremes. Jung wrote in Psychological Types, "The unconscious compensates the conscious attitude and, when this attitude is excessive, produces a counterposition which is equally excessive. Someone living an overly controlled, rational, achievement-oriented life might find themselves compensating through substances that provide chaos, irrationality, and release from performance pressure. The workaholic executive who drinks to decompress isn't just seeking relaxation, they're compensating for a life that has become mechanistic and soul-killing. The perfectionist who uses drugs to feel spontaneous isn't just seeking fun, they're compensating for rigid self-control that has eliminated authentic expression." Jung observed that addiction often emerges when people have suppressed essential aspects of their personality for social acceptability or success. The substance temporarily restores access to these disowned parts, creativity, sexuality, aggression, vulnerability, or playfulness that have been banned from conscious expression. Modern culture particularly creates conditions ripe for addictive compensation. Society rewards productivity, positivity, and control while pathologizing their opposites. People learn to suppress natural rhythms of rest, emotional expression, and spontaneity, creating psychological pressure that seeks release through artificial means. Notice what qualities emerge when you use substances: relaxation, confidence, creativity, social ease. These point to aspects of your authentic nature that need expression in daily life, rather than just during substance use. Archetypal possession. Jung understood addiction as a form of what he called archetypal possession, being overwhelmed by unconscious forces that operate beyond personal control. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he wrote, "When an archetype appears, it brings with it its own compelling authority. The addict becomes possessed by what Jung might call the Dionysian archetype, the ancient pattern of ecstatic dissolution, divine madness, and transcendence through intoxication. Every culture throughout history has recognized the power of consciousness, altering substances for spiritual purposes. Jung observed that modern addiction represents this archetypal energy, disconnected from sacred context and meaningful purpose. Archetypal possession explains why addiction feels so powerful, and why willpower alone proves insufficient. The person isn't just fighting personal craving, but archetypal forces that have operated in human consciousness for millennia. These energies demand expression and will find ways to manifest, whether through healthy or destructive means. The solution isn't to suppress archetypal energies, but to find appropriate channels for their expression. Many recovering addicts discover that spiritual practices, creative work, or service to others provide legitimate outlets for the same energies that drove their substance use. The unlived life. Perhaps Jung's most profound insight about addiction was its connection to what he called the unlived life, the gap between who someone is and who they were meant to become. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Addiction often represents flight from this terrifying self-acceptance." Jung observed that many addicts were highly sensitive, creative, or spiritually inclined individuals who had been forced to suppress their authentic nature to survive in conventional environments. The substance provided temporary access to the suppressed self, the artist, mystic, rebel, or free spirit that had been sacrificed for security or approval. The unlived life accumulates psychological pressure over time. Dreams, talents, and aspirations that have been consistently denied don't disappear. They go underground, creating what Jung called complexes that seek expression through any available means. Addiction provides one such outlet. Jung noted that midlife addiction often coincides with confrontation with unlived potential. The successful professional suddenly recognizes that their entire career has been built on others' expectations rather than authentic calling. The substance temporarily bridges the gap between actual and authentic life. Recovery requires what Jung called individuation, the courage to become who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. Jung's path to recovery. Jung's approach to addiction recovery focused on spiritual development rather than substance elimination. He believed that authentic spiritual experience could provide what substances counterfeit: transcendence, meaning, community, and relief from existential anxiety. Jung wrote to Bill Wilson, "His craving for alcohol was the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness." This insight became foundational to the spiritual approach of Alcoholics Anonymous. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called religious experience. Not necessarily traditional religion, but direct encounter with transcendent reality. This might involve meditation, prayer, nature connection, creative expression, or service to others. The key was finding authentic rather than artificial transcendence. He also stressed the necessity of community that supports authentic self-expression rather than conformity to social expectations. Jung's approach included shadow work, acknowledging and integrating the disowned aspects of personality that often drive compensatory behavior. Perhaps most importantly, Jung emphasized meaning-making. He observed that people could endure almost any suffering if they understood its purpose. Recovery becomes not just about eliminating substance use, but about discovering and pursuing authentic life purpose. Jung's path to recovery transforms addiction from shameful failure into spiritual crisis that, properly navigated, leads to profound personal transformation. The same sensitivity that made someone vulnerable to addiction becomes the foundation for deep spiritual development. The craving that once drove you toward substances can become the motivation that drives you toward authentic spiritual experience. The void that addiction temporarily filled points toward the meaningful life that awaits your courage to live it. The moment you believe someone else can make you angry, sad, or afraid, you've surrendered the most fundamental power you possess: the power to choose your own emotional responses. Most people live their entire lives as emotional puppets, dancing to strings pulled by family members, colleagues, strangers, and even memories of people long gone. Carl Jung discovered that emotional control is an illusion created by unconscious psychological projection. Nobody actually controls your emotions because nobody can reach inside your mind and flip emotional switches. What people can do is trigger unconscious material within you: unresolved conflicts, suppressed aspects of personality, and psychological wounds that create automatic reactive patterns. Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The person who consistently pushes your buttons isn't powerful. They're simply activating psychological material that you haven't yet integrated or resolved. The projection trap. Jung observed that intense emotional reactions to others often involve psychological projection, unconsciously attributing your own disowned qualities, conflicts, or unresolved issues to external people or situations. You're not really responding to them. You're responding to aspects of yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. When someone's arrogance triggers intense anger, you might be projecting your own suppressed arrogance. When someone's neediness creates overwhelming irritation, you could be reacting to your own unacknowledged dependency needs. When someone's success generates painful envy, you're encountering your own unlived potential reflected in another person. Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy, "Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face." The emotional landscape you perceive in others often mirrors your internal psychological territory that remains unconscious and unexamined. This creates what Jung called the projection trap, becoming emotionally controlled by others who are simply reflecting your own psychological material back to you. The trap operates automatically because projection happens beneath conscious awareness. Breaking free from projection requires what Jung termed withdrawing projections, recognizing that intense emotional reactions reveal more about your inner world than about external triggers. This doesn't mean that others' behavior is acceptable or that boundaries aren't necessary. It means understanding that your emotional intensity often contains valuable information about your own psychological development needs. The person who triggers your strongest reactions often carries projections of your most important unlived potential or unintegrated shadow material. Instead of avoiding or fighting them, Jung would suggest using these emotional reactions as roadmaps for personal growth, Start by examining your most frequent emotional triggers. What specific behaviors consistently provoke strong reactions? These patterns point directly to psychological material that needs your conscious attention. Understanding your complexes. Jung discovered that the psyche organizes around what he called complexes, clusters of emotionally charged thoughts, memories, and associations that operate semi-independently of conscious control. These complexes create predictable emotional vulnerabilities that others can trigger, often without realizing they're doing so. In The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, Jung wrote, "Complexes are autonomous groups of associations that have split off from consciousness. When someone activates your complex, you temporarily lose conscious control and react from the emotional pattern stored within that psychological cluster. Everyone develops complexes around core life themes: authority figures, romantic relationships, success and failure, abandonment, criticism, or recognition. These complexes form through repeated emotional experiences, particularly during childhood, and continue operating unconsciously throughout adult life unless deliberately addressed. Someone with an authority complex might experience automatic emotional reactions whenever they encounter criticism, direction, or control from others. The intensity of their response has little to do with present circumstances and everything to do with the unresolved emotional material contained within their authority complex. Complexes explain why certain types of people consistently trigger you, while others, displaying similar behaviors, don't affect you at all. The triggering person somehow resonates with your specific complex configuration, activating stored emotional patterns that feel overwhelming and immediate. Jung observed that complexes possess their own emotional logic. When a complex becomes activated, you temporarily become possessed by its emotional reality. Your usual personality recedes, and you react from the complex's perspective, often in ways that surprise you later. Understanding your complexes creates emotional freedom, because you can recognize when you're being triggered by internal psychological patterns rather than external circumstances. This recognition creates space between stimulus and response, the space where choice becomes possible. The shadow's emotional triggers. Jung's concept of the shadow, the repository of disowned and suppressed aspects of personality, plays a crucial role in emotional reactivity. People who embody your shadow qualities often provoke the strongest emotional responses because they represent parts of yourself that you cannot acknowledge or accept. In Man and His Symbols, Jung wrote, "The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be." When someone displays shadow qualities that you've rejected in yourself, their presence creates internal conflicts between recognition and denial, often manifesting as intense dislike, judgment, or emotional disturbance. Shadow projections create particularly powerful emotional triggers because they activate deep psychological defenses. The person who seems selfish might trigger someone who has completely suppressed their own healthy selfishness. The individual who appears weak could disturb someone who refuses to acknowledge their own vulnerability. Shadow work, the process of recognizing and integrating disowned aspects of personality, dramatically reduces emotional reactivity. When you accept your own capacity for the qualities you judge in others, their behavior loses its power to disturb your psychological equilibrium. Jung noted that shadow integration doesn't mean acting out negative qualities, but rather acknowledging their existence within yourself. This acknowledgement eliminates the need to project them onto others and reduces the emotional charge around witnessing these qualities in external circumstances. The people who trigger your most intense judgment often carry projections of your most important shadow material. Instead of focusing on changing or avoiding them, focus on understanding what aspects of yourself they're reflecting. Developing psychological objectivity. Jung emphasized the development of what he called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe your own emotional processes without being completely identified with them. This creates what he termed a transcendent function that can mediate between conscious intentions and unconscious reactions. In Psychological Types, Jung wrote, "The transcendent function manifests itself as a quality of conjoined opposites. This function allows you to simultaneously experience emotions while maintaining enough psychological distance to choose your responses consciously." Psychological objectivity develops through what Jung called active imagination, deliberately engaging with your own psychological processes as if they were separate from your core identity. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you learn to observe anger is present, or "this situation has activated an angry response pattern." This subtle shift in perspective creates enormous emotional freedom. When you identify completely with emotional states, you become their prisoner. When you develop the capacity to observe them, you maintain choice about how to respond. Jung distinguished between being possessed by emotions and having emotions. Possession means losing conscious control and reacting automatically. Having emotions means experiencing them while maintaining enough conscious awareness to choose appropriate responses. Practice what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, allowing contradictory feelings to coexist without immediately resolving them into action. This builds tolerance for emotional complexity and reduces the compulsion to react immediately when triggered. Emotional sovereignty. Jung's ultimate goal was what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and self-determined. Emotional sovereignty represents a crucial aspect of this development, where your emotional life becomes primarily internally generated rather than externally controlled. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." Emotional sovereignty means that your sense of worth, peace, and happiness depends primarily on your relationship with yourself rather than on others' behavior, approval, or emotional states. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected. Emotional sovereignty allows for deeper, more authentic relationships because you engage with others from choice rather than need, from strength rather than emotional dependency. Sovereign individuals can empathize with others' emotions without absorbing them, set boundaries without guilt, and maintain inner stability regardless of external emotional chaos. They've developed what Jung called a strong ego that can interact with challenging personalities without losing psychological center. True emotional control isn't about managing others or avoiding difficult situations. It's about developing such psychological completeness that your emotional life becomes primarily self-determined, allowing you to engage with the world from authentic choice rather than unconscious reactivity.